Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're tackling a fascinating piece of history, the transition of the Lord's Supper. Have you ever wondered how a vibrant, noisy, full-table feast shared among friends evolved into, well, a quiet, bite-sized ritual? It's a pretty dramatic shift when you think about it. Today, we're relying entirely on our source material to unpack this profound structural change. Okay, let's dive into this. If you walk into many modern gatherings today, the Lord's Supper is often experienced as a highly solemn, deeply individualized moment. You know the drill. You might receive a tiny cracker or wafer and a little thimble of juice. It's quiet, it's orderly, and it's highly regulated. But the text we're examining today presents a stark contrast to that modern experience. It actually transports us right back to the original, full meal gatherings of the first century, suggesting that the modern practice represents a massive departure from the original apostolic model. So the big question is, how in the world do we get from a full physical feast to a tiny symbolic wafer?
To understand this shift, we absolutely have to understand the starting point. We need to look at the Greek word ekklesia. In the first century, the ecclesia was the original assembly of Christ's followers. And what's absolutely crucial to grasp about these early gatherings is that they did not take place in formal church buildings or massive cathedrals. They were organic, household-based fellowships. Picture crowding into your neighbor's living room for dinner. The primary focus of the ecclesia was horizontal, communal unity. It was democratic, it was intimate, and it was entirely centered around the physical gathering of believers in each other's actual homes.
In those intimate household settings, the apostolic practice wasn't some quick, symbolic ritual you tacked onto the end of a service. It was what historical accounts call the breaking of bread, which was a literal full meal. Historical accounts in Acts and 1 Corinthians show us that this was an actual dinner that provided genuine, physical nourishment. But it was definitely more than just eating, right? The physical act of sharing that full meal together served as a tangible proclamation of the Lord's death and a vivid, real-world expression of the body's unity. The food-based banquet itself was the mechanism for fellowship.
Now, I want to highlight a really specific number here: 0. Based on the source material, there is exactly 0 evidence in the New Testament of an ordinance utilizing symbolic minimal elements. Let that sink in for a second. In the original context of the first century ecclesia, there was no separate, miniature ritual carved out of the gathering. The meal itself embodied the spiritual nourishment of the believers. There was no tiny wafer. The full, nourishing banquet was the entirety of the practice.
So let's map this out chronologically to see how it all unfolded. We start in the first century with the apostolic assemblies, those house-based, full meal gatherings we just talked about. Then we hit a massive historical roadblock in the 4th century, identified as the Constantinian shift. This single era irreversibly altered the trajectory of the practice, ultimately leading us all the way to the modern era, which is characterized by the minimal wafer and juice we see today. We really need to zoom in on what happened during that critical middle step.
Enter the 4th century, and Emperor Constantine, who acted as the ultimate catalyst for this monumental transformation. Under Constantine, Christianity experienced a totally dramatic pivot. It went from being an illicit, underground, house-based faith to a fully state-sanctioned public religion. And as Christianity became an imperial institution, the architecture and the administration of the faith were completely reshaped to mirror Roman administrative structures. Essentially, the faith was formalized into a massive public entity overnight.
And this brilliantly illustrates the night-and-day difference between these two eras. On one side, we have the first century model: horizontal fellowship, communal unity, house gatherings, and full meals. On the flip side, look at the 4th century model: vertical administration, clerical control, massive public basilicas, and minimal elements. The democratic, household-focused fellowship of the early church was fundamentally replaced by a new, top-down hierarchy that required a distinctly different way of operating.
Which brings us to a really critical development: the separation of the meal. As this new imperial institution grew, it suddenly needed a distinct priestly class to manage its sacred rites. To consolidate clerical control, this new hierarchy separated the formal Eucharist from the communal meal, which historically was known as the agape feast. By untethering the ritual from the democratic shared dinner, the hierarchy was able to rebrand the Lord's Supper as an official liturgical act, one that could only be performed by an officially ordained celebrant.
By moving the rite out of homes and into grand state-sanctioned basilicas under exclusive clerical jurisdiction, the institution essentially stripped the meal of its original character. This shift effectively ended the congregational autonomy that had thrived during the era of house-based banquets.
Think about it. When the Lord's Supper was a legitimate food-based banquet managed by the assembly itself, it belonged entirely to the community. But once it was stripped down and moved into the basilica, it became the exclusive domain of the hierarchy.
Now, the introduction of the wafer and the thimble, those standardized, bite-sized portions, wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was actually highly strategic. By stripping the event of its character as a full meal, the newly formalized ecclesiastical system achieved three highly specific institutional objectives. Those were standardization for mass control, the separation of the sacred and profane, and the replacement of meaning. Let's break down exactly how this minimalist ritual accomplished each of these goals for the institution.
First up, standardization for mass control. Think about the logistics here. Managing a full, noisy feast for hundreds of people, that is chaotic and inherently community-driven. But administering a tiny wafer, that requires minimal effort and ensures strict top-down control by a priest. A ritualized miniature dose is incredibly easy to commodify and administer. It dramatically shifts the focus away from the horizontal interactive fellowship of the assembly and redirects it toward a vertical, formalistic administration tightly controlled by a hierarchy.
This control also relied heavily on Objective 2, creating a strict dividing line between the sacred and the profane. The Constantinian influence fostered a very rigid dualism by reducing the messy, joyous, shared communal meal to a sterile, symbolic token. The emerging ecclesiastical hierarchy effectively marginalized the role of shared physical nourishment. This successfully reinforced the function of the clergy as the primary exclusive mediators of grace, completely separating the holy moment from the everyday, ordinary lives of the believers. Ultimately, all of this led to our third point: a total replacement of meaning. As the early Jewish roots of the assembly were actively suppressed, the original understanding of bread and wine, as symbols that sanctified a full, real meal, was entirely lost. In its place, the institutional church installed a rigid theological abstraction. They replaced the foundational, physical practice of a body gathering for a communal meal with a highly regulated symbol that could be easily managed, strictly policed, and institutionally defined. So, the crucial point is exactly what this quote from our source material lays out. The historical record leads to a pretty stark conclusion. The shift from a communal, full meal assembly to the modern minimal ordinance of the wafer and juice is, quote, not a development of biblical practice, but an explicit departure from it. This wasn't just some natural, innocent evolution of style over time. It was a direct consequence of an organizational shift into a hierarchical, institutionalized system.
Wrapping up this historical narrative, a very clear conclusion emerges from the text. The ecclesiastical system ultimately prioritized administrative control over the original apostolic practice. By stripping the Lord's Supper of its status as a communal meal, the institution effectively insulated itself from the organic, unpredictable assembly of believers. It traded the deeply connective, democratic fellowship of the first century for a centralized, ritualistic framework that ensured hierarchical authority and maintained strict orthodoxy.
As we conclude this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative question to chew on. What is genuinely lost when organic, messy fellowship is replaced by a clean institutional ritual? The history we've looked at today forces us to reflect on how the physical architecture and the administration of a gathering don't just change the logistics of an event, they might fundamentally alter its spiritual meaning and the very nature of community itself. Thank you so much for diving into this historical analysis with me today. Next time you gather, maybe consider the architecture of the room and what it's telling you to do.